before we get going on that, what I would like to do, if possible, is get an idea of who's in the room. So if you can open up your chat function, please, and just going to get some idea on experiences in the room. So the first question I have for you is, do you work in a team? And if so, how many are in that team? So if you can just put yes or no, and then the number, that'd be awesome. Cheers, Rachel, leading the way. I have 25. Okay, cool. Great. Yes, 2. Okay, cool. So everyone works in teams essentially, which is great. The second question is, do you lead a team? Okay, and again, if it might be the same team, if yes or no, just type yes or no, and then a number would be great. How many are in the team that you lead? 2. Same, great. 6, 2, great. Fantastic. Okay, thank you. And then final question, a little bit of thinking. What is the one biggest challenge that you face in either as a leader or in the team that you're in? What challenge does your team face? This is good. We're challenging Rachel. This is good. I've not been taught how to lead. Okay, communication. New and changing team members. Yeah. Me not letting go. I love the honesty. That's brilliant. Lack of strategy filtered down. Yeah. Communication. Yeah. See, just give it another 10 seconds. See if any more. Varied enthusiasm. Yeah. Okay. So I think we're going to tie on a few of those, which is great over the next 17 minutes, but let's definitely tap back into the chat for the discussion, because I think we'll get some really interesting comments there as well. Okay, so onto the 3 ideas. So idea 1 is simple, okay, but it's no less profound, right? So just bear with me. When you look at it first, you think, well, hold on, that's quite obvious, but many teams don't make this conscious step. And it's just simply an acknowledgement of a commitment. So if we look at a team at work, typically, and like a normal team of 5 individuals, they will have an output. And one would like to think that output is both aligned and equal. But those of us who have been in enough teams, and I think someone even alluded to it in the chat, actually often efforts are not only unequal, they are often divergent, and they can even be conflicting. And this is not necessarily through malintention. It just could be through miscommunication. Someone actually ends up adding more friction to what you're doing rather than adding value. So the first element when we're working in a team is we need to acknowledge who's in that team and actually agree that we are all in a team together. Not only that, but that we have a collective output. This isn't always the case. Sometimes we work in groups across businesses that have separate reporting lines and our results aren't interdependent, but a lot of teams do. And when it is, we need to make sure that we have an acknowledgement. And critically, that our collaboration or our ways of working, our behaviors are exactly what determine and drive that output. So super simple first step, we acknowledge that we're in a team and that it's our collaboration that determines our collective output. The second piece then, more difficult, is that we all consciously commit to one another and collectively that we will continuously improve that collaboration. So what does that look like? So on the soccer pitch, it's, how do we pass? What time do we turn up to training? How do we do the strength and conditioning? How do we study our opponents? How do we learn from matches? In the military, for us, it was how do we build up a target pack? How do we develop a plan for a mission? How do we share those ideas? How do we rehearse? How do we, when we're on the ground, how do we move? How do we communicate? How do we react to casualties or the situation changing? And when we get off the ground, how do we review that mission to learn from how we can improve? In the business space, it's how does this team interact? How do we send emails? How do we communicate? How do we pitch? How do we learn from pitches? How do we build proposals? If your team consciously commit to improve their collaboration, take time to do so, your output will guaranteed increase, but it requires this feedback. The question is, why does feedback not exist as often in the business case? And it's very simple. We're just busy, right? Everyone is always busy. And I've yet to meet the team that says, no, we've got plenty of headcount. We've got more than enough people than what we need. So we typically roll through the IDA cycle. So information comes in, a new email, a new task, a decision is made, we carry out an action, and we roll straight through the cycle again, fighting fires, bouncing through our emails. What we're not doing is taking time to pause, feedback, learn what went well, double down on those behaviors, look to see how we can improve and how we can do things differently. When we do make time for that in our calendars and our diaries as a team, then not only do our ways of working behave, we get to better decisions, which will result in better actions, which result in less stressful situations. But perhaps more on that later. So that's a super simple first idea. It's an acknowledgement we work in a team, and it's a commitment to consciously, continually improve our collective collaboration or our ways of working. Okay, idea number 2. So we know that our collaboration determines our output. Next then is let's focus on the team's behaviors. So my first recommendation is to use a team's model of some description. So these are 2 of the most popular. Patrick Lencioni's book, The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, is the most famous without a doubt. Gordon Curfew on the right, this is arguably backed up by more rigorous academic research, but they all display a way your team can work together more effectively. I'm going to pull out a few behaviours, given the time today, which are common to both, but will definitely help your team in the long run. So I think someone mentioned in the chat, lack of strategic clarity coming from the exec. This is obviously very common, but it's also common in our own teams that sometimes we will have slightly different versions of the truth or slightly different understandings of what we're trying to achieve here. So getting that complete clarity over what we're doing and why is key. And that can be either in your activities or in meetings, as in a meeting agenda, whatever it is, but feel free to use this as a model that we've developed that kind of helps along this a little bit. So the P stands for purpose. Now, what do we want to do and why? So being very clear on the reason why we're doing things and linking that to the strategic objectives. If what your team's doing doesn't tie into achieving the objectives, the levels above you, you've got to ask yourself why you're doing it. And often we find ourselves doing things, we've always done it, or the process says we should do it. But unless what we're doing ties into that, you've got to question it. So being really clear on what we're doing and why. The second piece is then, what does success look like? What's the outcome we're looking to? What's our end state? Once we've got that clear, we can then dive into the situation itself. Okay, let's understand the facts and what assumptions are at play. Do we have any constraints? What freedoms do we have? And only then can we jump into developing a plan, developing what our actions. Now, as humans, we tend to have a massive bias for action. We just want to get stuff done, solutionize. We take a quick look at something and we develop a plan to solve it, without spending a good amount of time on the purpose, end state, and awareness. And if you spend more time on those 3 areas, then your plan is guaranteed to be more effective. Now, sometimes you're going to be given a task like this. Sometimes you're not going to be given a task. You have to respond to a situation. So you just rejig the model a little bit, because you'll be having to look at the situation and the challenge that you face before you can come up with a plan. Now, as we work in teams, almost everyone on the call works in teams. Working through purpose, end state, and awareness, you're going to be doing it together. Now, the way you get to the best decision as a team is to have significant amounts of this rigorous debate. Lencioni calls it conflict, constructive conflict. Curfew talks about having the courage to have and manage conflict. But the best teams have honest and open, constructive debate on ideas. Now, we've all read Leadership 101 and we said, make sure you include the team in decisions. So you go around the table, what do people think? And everyone puts their opinion on the table. Then you make a decision, you drive forward and you think, yeah, the team are really engaged and everyone gave their opinion. They're all, they all feel part of the gang. The problem is that often you're not getting to actually the best decision. And it's not enough just to throw opinions on the table. We really want to drill down into second, third order effects. What are the pros? What are the cons? How can we get to the best decision? What are the benefits of that course of action? What are the negatives? How can we improve upon it? Now, some of you might be having these debates, which is great, but I'm going to ask you a question now. And if the answer is yes, then you're probably not having enough of it. If you are someone who hovers before, you don't press the unmute button to speak, or saying, I'll just let it go, or you're a bit nervous to say something because you're not sure how it can be received, then your team have not set up the environment you need to have that open, honest, rigorous, and constructive debate. And if I throw this back to the Afghanistan example, the team of 5 of us who were developing the plan for the team of 30, we would have really strong emotional debates, because clearly in that situation, it's, the consequences are severe. But you have to have high levels of this in order to get to that. So when we talk about trust, that's a word that's bound around quite a lot, and we like to think we know what it means. But if I asked you what the definition of trust is, I guaranteed I'd get 10 different answers. I'm not talking about predictive trust. So I'm not talking about the type of trust that says, right, I trust Jenny to turn up to the meeting on time because I've known her for 10 years, she's never late. That's just a predictor of actions. The trust I'm talking about is Jenny and I have such a good relationship that I can be open and honest and vulnerable in front of her with how I'm doing, what help I need if I've failed, or how, where I need assistance. When we look at that trust, we drill down, what's it made up of? What enables me to have that level of dialogue with Jenny? And there's some research, which is now 28 years old, but it's still stood the test of time. It's phenomenal, that trust is made up of these three things. The first is competence. We trust people who are competent in the area we are trusting to be competent in, okay? So for example, you trust a pilot to fly the plane, you might not trust the pilot to do your accounts like you do for Rachel. The second piece is integrity. So we trust people who live by a set of values and behave in a way that is aligned to our own. So they do what they say they're going to do, they don't gossip behind our back, behaviors like that I'm sure we can all relate to. And the final bit is benevolence. We trust people who care about us. And if people want the best for us, we're going to trust them. So when we look back at having that really constructive debate, people are not going to be put out of joint or hurt or fearless if you go and drill down into their idea and show the issues with it, because they know they've built up this level of trust, they know you care about them. And so when we're having that rigorous debate, we want to be, yes, highly assertive, but also do so with high empathy. And we can do that by building this trust, behaving in these three ways. Quick side note, a lot of leaders ask me, how do I build trust in my team? The easiest way to build trust is to give trust. So if you push trust onto other people, it will reciprocate. Okay, so when we're looking back on the model here, if we just look down at key actions, it's critical here, not just to write a list of things that need to get done, but to assign them to people. And so people are accountable for when they need to deliver and by what time. Typically, we think of accountability as being top down by the leader of the team, but the most powerful form of accountability is peer-to-peer. And that's the behavior you want to generate in your team, that people are holding one another to account, not just on the delivery of tasks or objectives or what they said they're going to be doing, but how you behave. Your code of conduct, your team charter, whatever it is, the behavioral norms that your team have created over time, you hold them to account against that. In the Marines, we wear this flash on our shoulder. It says Royal Marines Commando. And the peer-to-peer accountability in the Marines is so strong that if someone steps out of line or behaves in a way that isn't aligned to the organization, someone will say, "Oi, mate, check flashes," which basically is a nudge for them to look down, read the flash, and remember who they are and the way they should be behaving. And it's incredibly cutting. You wouldn't think check flashes could be such an insult, but it is. And that's the power of peer-to-peer accountability. And you're not relying on the manager or the leader to hold your team to account. Okay, so that's idea two. Very simple, use a teams model, think about clarity, how do we build trust, and how do we hold one another accountable? On to the final idea for today before we open up for a bit of discussion. So this is really for the leaders, which I think is most of you, how we interact with our team. And it's called leading with intent. So if we think of this as a typical team, you've got the workers or the teammates are the white dots, and the leader is the red, the orange dot. And the workers, the team, will be cracking along their normal tasks. And when they come across something they don't understand or a challenge or a difficulty, they'll send information up for the manager to make a decision, which comes back down. Okay, this is pretty standard. I'm sure everyone will kind of reflect and recognize that and see that in their own team behaviors. Now, this model of management is well over 100 years old and was created really through the factory period. Now, it was arguably well suited to the factory period because the factory line had a finite number of variables. Okay, yes, it was complicated. There were hundreds or thousands of variables, but the problem set facing the factory line could be known. It was knowable. And so over time, you had an ill-educated, unmotivated workforce. They would send information up for a more educated, experienced manager to make a decision, which they would then enact. And you've got people like Taylor, who wrote Scientific Management, which drove all toward ultra efficiency, always getting to the right decision. And that in that environment arguably works. The problem we face is that this model of management is still existing in the world today, but the world we face today is not a finite problem set. It's anything but. The number of variables that we face as a business interacting with the market, competitors, clients, the number of variables is huge. And the second and third order knock-on effect of those is exponential. And you only have to look at recent years, Brexit, Trump, COVID, Ukraine conflict, energy crisis, the landscape we're having to interact with and make decisions against is well, we use the phrase VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, or ambiguous, but it's significantly more difficult than the factory line. But this method of management still exists. And what's the problem with that? There's a few. The first is that the workforce is no longer uneducated and ill-equipped. They're incredibly intelligent, incredibly ambitious, incredibly motivated individuals. And yet every time they're sending information up, they are therefore abdicating any responsibility or accountability or ownership on the solutions to that problem. They're pushing information up to the boss to make a decision. We're also assuming that the boss is in the best place to make the decision, but if they're not interacting with the same information space, which is changing so quickly as the workers, how are they necessarily the best person to make the decision? We're also potentially overloading the manager with all these decisions and not giving them the time and space to focus on what they need to do. And the final concern with this model is that as you layer this model up in a large hierarchy, you end up getting decision stool or unnecessary decision escalation, where decisions keep on getting pushed up the chain with people too nervous or not sure what to do before making a decision. So we know we need to change this or tweak it. The question is how. Now, the phrase empowerment gets bounded around a lot, but the question is, how do you do empowerment? Now, this is the Tenenbaum-Schmidt leadership continuum. Okay, 60 years old, but it's still taught in a lot of leadership books, and there are elements which are good. But let's talk through why I brought up today. So the idea on this is that as you develop as a leader with your team, you want to move from left to right across the continuum. So sometimes we'll have to tell them what to do, but really we want to sell them on the idea. We want to suggest ways they can do it. We want to consult with them, join with them in making a decision. Sometimes we'll delegate that decision, or you can abdicate responsibility completely. And so you can see as you move from left to right, the authority for the manager decreases, freedom for your team increases. So we know we want to be over on the right-hand side. But we've all been delegated tasks, and this has happened, where the manager has the long screwdriver and still stays in touch and looking over our shoulder all the time. And we've also had those managers who abdicate responsibility completely and say crack on, and that's not helpful either for our own support or making sure that our efforts are aligned. So we know there's somewhere between the delegation and abdication is the sweet spot to be. The question is where? How can we delegate a decision to our team but still remain confident they're going to make a good decision and it's going to be aligned with what we want it to do as an organization? The answer is this: intent. We lead with intent. So what do I mean by that? I mean, we tell our team the effect we want them to achieve and why it's important. So we're giving them the overall outcome, the direction we want to go in, and where it fits or why it's important at their level, your level, and the level above you. What we avoid telling them is what to do and how to do it. Now, you might think that is a very subtle, nuanced difference, but the difference is key because we're no longer telling them what to do and how to do it. We're actually pushing that decision down onto them, which means they have to understand the situation and devise a plan to come up and attack it. And that's helpful for two things. Firstly, it's engaging them. So their engagement, innovation, morale will all increase. The other massive benefit of this is by pushing the decision-making down onto them, they will understand the situation they're having to deal with and come up with a plan. Now, when that situation changes, because you've been clear to them on why it's important, your intent, they're in a really good place to make a decision to either exploit opportunity or to recover from a potential catastrophe. If, on the other hand, you have told them, this is what I want you to do, and this is how to do it, and they don't understand the reason they're doing it or where it fits into the wider organization, when the situation changes, they might not do anything because they don't understand the relevance of that change. So let's talk about that in a little bit more detail. What we're trying to do here is switch the old model. So rather than information coming up to you as a boss, you're sending information down, and this is in the form of your intent. So the effect I want you to achieve and why it's important. What you're also telling them is you want to arm them with all the information they need to make a good decision. So you're telling them what's relevant at your level. So where you see risk lie, where you see opportunity, priorities, and also what's going on in at your boss's level, what the competition are doing, what the market's saying, what regulatory changes are coming up. So you want to basically push as much information down onto your team so they're armed and equipped to make the best decision. And they will then back brief you on what that decision was.
Now, you might say, my team are not, can't push decisions down onto my team. They're not ready, or they're not able to make those decisions. And what we do is we put some constraints around that. So those might be fiscal, budgetary, headcount, space, time. But within those constraints, we minimize them as much as possible. So we give our team as much freedom and space to move in, so they have as much autonomy as possible. This is what we call decentralized decision making. So we're pushing decision making down the organization. People ask, how far down the organization should we push the decision? And the answer to this is where the information comes in. So decisions should get made where the information comes into the organization. Okay, if it's getting escalated levels up, there's something that can be tweaked and improved there. Now, if our people are going to make good decisions, they need to have all the information to make those good decisions. So creating a shared consciousness where we share information and we share what's going on amongst each other is also key, and a key area to focus on. Now, some of you might be thinking, hold on a minute, I can't push all these decisions down on my team. They're not trained, they're not experienced. My knowledge of what to do is so much more than theirs. How can they be making good decisions all the time? And so it's important to know this is a scale, okay? It's a ladder to climb up. Now, there will always be times where you have to tell your team what to do. Okay, I'll tell you what to do. Now, that might be because there's a crisis situation or there's an emergency. You don't want to turn up at a road traffic accident and suddenly have a little conflab on, what do we think we should do? You need quite assertive instructions. So those times will always exist, but they are in the minority. And so when a teammate comes up to you and says, I've got this problem, what should I do? If it is time dependent, so if it's not time dependent, as most of them aren't, well, then we need to coach them to making the decision. So you can say, well, what do you see? Tell me what you think about the situation. What would you like to do? And ultimately, what do you intend to do? And we want to get to a stage where your teammates or team members come up to you and say, look, I've got this problem. I intend to do X. And then your role as a leader is to say yes, or if no, coach them to the right answer. So over time, we're moving from a direction giver to decision approver. And once they get more comfortable making these decisions, and those constraints that you put around them ease because you're more comfortable with them making those decisions, then they will be back briefing on what they did. Indeed, you just be up to them, well, what have you been doing? Because you're confident they've been making those decisions in the right space. So it's a bit of a ladder and it's a progression, but the key is to coach them. So we always try and push the decision down onto them where it should sit. Now, if we compare that to Tenenbaum and Schmidt that we looked at a while ago, the key difference here and the powerful difference between leading with intent and the Tenenbaum and Schmidt model is that the manager makes the decision in all of these areas. It's only when they delegate, abdicate, the manager doesn't make decision. Whereas with leading with intent, yes, the manager will make the decision in these small number of cases, which are few and far between, but actually you're pushing the decision down onto your teammate for the vast majority, which means a whole ton of things, not least that person's growing, developing. They're also best placed to make decisions. The decisions are happening quicker. You have more time and space because you're not getting bothered by all these decisions that should be made below you. Give you time and space to think on the up and out problem set, not the down and in, which you should be. So to recap, we want to move from decision giver to direction approver, and finally action reviewer. So those are three ideas. The first one, again, work in a team. It's an acknowledgement that we're in a team and our collective output. And we consciously commit to improving that output. The second idea is focus on team behavior. So use a model. How do we get clarity? How do we build trust? And how do we increase accountability? And the final bit is lead with intent. So decentralized decision-making, push decision-making down onto your team and make sure they have all the information and awareness in order to do that. And use the ladder to coach them to a decision because they won't be necessarily keen to make one straight away. So that's it for today. Albany Peak, that's my business. I'm just going to take 30 seconds on that to give an awareness. So this is what we do. So we basically help business teams get around some of the problems we talked about today in the team leadership space. How do we break down silos? How do we make our meetings more effective? How do we essentially execute our strategy and deal with the problems that we face day to day? We do this through looking at three areas of the model. The first is teams and leadership behaviors, and we've kind of scratched the surface a tiny bit today with that. The second is getting real clarity on why the team or organization exists, where it's going and how it's going to get there. And crucially, cascading this down the whole organization so everyone is crystal clear on what they're doing and how that feeds into the organizational direction. And the final bit is then how do we as a team or a network of teams agilely and adapt to an execution against that. And we have a methodology in place through performance reviews and software that we help that as well. These are clearly interdependent, and we work with clients typically for sort of a year to 2 years, and it's a mixture of experiences, immersive experience as a team out in the Brecon Beacons. We do workshops, a lot of kind of workshops and performance reviews, and we also layer in one-to-one coaching with that as well. So that's me. You can find me on LinkedIn. As I said, we're currently in the process of a rebrand. So that's my email, my new email, don@albanypeak.com. Feel free to drop me a line. Albanypeak.com has just a holding page on it for now, but as of April, it will be live. But yeah, that's me. So I'm going to stop sharing, Rachel. That's cool.